Hello and welcome to this 46th episode in my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. The best way I can think of to let you know what I'm going to talk about in this video is to start with a quote from Garrison Keillor, who hosted the American radio variety show called A Prairie Home Companion for many years. One Saturday night long ago, while enjoying his show, I heard Keillor say, quote, "Intelligence is like four-wheel drive. It allows you to get stuck in more remote places," unquote. I laughed so hard I cried. I could relate. I'd gotten myself stuck, well stuck on many occasions with the help of intellect. Maybe you can relate. So what I want to talk about is the intellectual four-wheel drive of deconstructionism, where it can get us stuck, and yes, why that can be lethal. At the end, I'll make some comments about what this has to do with psychotherapy. Most people by now are aware of the term spiritual bypassing. If you aren't, it basically refers to using spiritual teachings and practices to avoid the difficulty of confronting life on its own terms. This might mean avoiding the challenges of forming intimate relationships, figuring out how to earn a living, dealing with traumas and painful emotions, and basically showing up in an embodied way in one's life. For those not inclined toward spiritual things, the intellect can serve the same purpose, thus intellectual bypassing. This is the detour that can be taken by the intellectual engine of deconstructionism. Let me be clear at the start. Just as spiritual teachings and practices can have profound value, so too can the intellect. It's not that spirituality or the intellect are wrong or bad. It's a matter of how they're engaged and for what purposes. I remember an old Hagar the Horrible cartoon where Hagar's sidekick suggests that he pound his sword into a plowshare. Hagar thought about this and said, "Yes, you could do a lot of damage with a plowshare." Maybe spiritual practices and postmodern theory are potential plowshares that too often get used for other purposes. If they provide a means for fully valuing and engaging with life, then they offer excellent perspectives and tools. If they provide a means for bypassing or escaping from life, then they are problematic. Life eventually and ultimately claims its due if we ignore it and try to live outside of its requirements. I'm focusing on deconstructionism because it is the central intellectual tool of critical theory and postmodernism, both of which inform critical social justice. Let's start with a basic definition of deconstructionism. Developed by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida in the mid-60s, deconstructionism is a method for analyzing the fundamental conceptual distinctions and hierarchies in language and culture. Four of its core concepts are as follows. First one, difference. This is a term coined by Derrida that points to both the deferred meaning of language and the great many differences there are in the interpretation of any linguistic expression. By deferred, what is meant that any given word can only be defined by using other words. These other words can only be defined by using yet more words. The result is that the final meaning of a word cannot be arrived at. It's always deferred. Binary oppositions. Here, Derrida points to the binary nature of language, such that things and ideas are split into pairs, like hot and cold, man and woman, good and bad, and so forth. His observation was that these are often considered hierarchically, such that one is thought to be better than the other, when in fact they depend on one another to even be perceived. Further, such binaries are not stable or fixed, but instead are fluid and ambiguous. Derrida questions the Western tradition of favoring speech over written language, and the assertion that speech is more accurately represents reality. His assertion is that both are equally incapable of representing reality. Logocentrism. For Derrida, logocentrism is the false belief that language, or logos, can accurately and transparently represent reality. This isn't so much a separate concept as it is an umbrella term that includes the others. Basically, it is Derrida's observation that all communication is textual, which means that it is constructed through a network of signs and symbols, all of which are unstable in their meaning due to difference, binary oppositions, and logocentrism. With this understanding, critical social justice then takes aim at social constructions. These are what it wants to deconstruct. Social constructs basically include all human knowledge, norms, and conventions. Let me pause again to be clear. I'm not going to refute any of this, except perhaps that all communication is textual. In fact, I agree with the rest of it. I think Derrida got a lot of things right. The problem, which is a big one, I will argue later, is what deconstructionism leaves out. If you're liking this video, please do one or all of the following. Give it a like, subscribe to my channel, click the bell for notifications, leave me a comment, and share it with a friend. As I'm trying to grow my channel, your help will be greatly appreciated. Thanks. Now back to our topic. I find in critical theory and postmodernism there are two primary, usually implicit assumptions. They are behind the scenes, but they do a lot of rhetorical work. The first involves the concept of a provable, absolute, objective truth or reality. In contrast to this rather vague and endlessly philosophically debated idea, the failure of human knowing is revealed by deconstructionism. In the end, what we think we know is just socially constructed. There is therefore something arbitrary about it. We could have made up anything else and assigned meaning to the objects of our awareness in any infinite number of ways, none of which could have possibly had a grasp on the eternally elusive thing we call reality. The value of constructed truths, or social constructions, is reduced to near insignificance in the face of what an absolute truth might be and require. If only the proof of a rock-solid reality could justify adopting a social construct. And yes, it's ironic. On the one hand, deconstructionism rejects the very idea of an absolute truth, and on the other, it is only by implicit comparison to such a thing that it devalues what truths we do construct. To be fair, it's right to be critical of claims of absolute truth. The problem is that deconstructionism doesn't seem to recognize, much less elaborate on, the need for collective, reliable, even if provisional, functional truths that serve life in a collective. I think it's important to notice that life doesn't accept or reject our ideas about what is true based just on rationality or logic. Rationality may give us greater ability to predict and control things that matter for preserving life, but this doesn't resolve the ontological question about the reality of these things. Instead, life simply rewards what works toward the preservation of life. All those superstitions of our ancestors, the pre-modern irrationality of religion, including the belief in God. Life has no problem with this, as long as these irrational beliefs have served important functions for social cohesion and collaboration, and provided rules for behavior or moral codes that served life in a collective. If something turns out to serve life better than rationality, it's reasonable to imagine that whatever that is, life will affirm it. To identify the second implicit assumption, we can consider what critical social justice has to say about social constructions, apart from their lack of absolute truth. Its overwhelmingly consistent interpretation is that social constructions are used for wielding power to oppress people. This is the only function of social constructs that critical social justice gives any attention to. Even the social construct of punctuality has been identified as a tool of white supremacy. So what implicit assumption underlies this concern with oppression? I think in tandem with the idea of absolute truth is also the idea of absolute freedom. This is the ultimate abstract reference point by which everything social is measured by critical social justice. Connected to its emancipatory agenda, there is another implicit assumption. That is that suffering is bad. Otherwise, why be concerned about oppression down to the minute microaggressions? Because oppression causes suffering. Critical social justice doesn't talk much about suffering generally or identify any other sources of it other than oppression, but it is clearly concerned with it. More about this later. Critical social justice is recursive preoccupation with oppressors and the oppressed, demonstrates its commitment to an emancipatory telos. It seems that any and everything built into a social construction that in any way limits the freedom of individuals must be deconstructed and revealed for the power grab that it is. In fact, this is the only function of social constructs that it seems to recognize. It's hard to imagine any social construct that we are asked to endorse and abide by that does not in some way have an impact on our freedom. There is rarely, if ever, as far as I'm seeing, that critical social justice preserves social constructions that have more salutary consequences than oppression. We could call this hyper-liberalism, and its preoccupation with eradicating even minor occurrences of socially caused suffering we could call hyper-humanitarianism. It takes considerable intellectual effort to deconstruct all knowledge and norms based on the principles of deconstructionism and prove the impossibility of absolute truth while simultaneously arguing implicitly for absolute freedom and the elimination of suffering. To even understand this well enough to offer reasonable critique takes some intellectual doing. So, why is the title of this video The Lethal Intellectual Bypassing of Deconstructionism? Why lethal? Where is it that this four-wheel drive is likely to get us stuck? Basically, I would say outside of life, a place where we cannot survive for long. Because I recognize that this may seem like a hyperbolic statement, I want to explain why I don't think it's hyperbolic. The key to understanding this is to examine what other functions social constructions serve besides oppression. Basically, social constructions allow us to communicate with and understand one another, even if what we understand falls short of the absolute truth. This provides for social cohesion and collaboration. To meet the demands of life, survive and reproduce, we've evolved as a social species. Take away social constructions, and this would not be possible. Ergo, a lethal consequence. Deconstructionism focuses on language, but social constructs precede language. For just one example, consider the social agreements evolved in play fighting among dogs. There are clear rules for how dogs are to engage and how the rough and tumble should proceed. These are not conceptualized or communicated with words. Nevertheless, they are followed as they facilitate ongoing cooperative relations for dogs. As humans have mammalian brains, no doubt our behavior is also guided by instinctual social agreements and nonverbal constructs. Perhaps as our social world became more complex, language evolved to help us manage these agreements about the world, the objects in it, and what behaviors would be most conducive to a cooperative, life-preserving way of living together. Just maybe reducing social constructs to the inadequacies of language in order to dismiss them misses the deeper evolutionary communicative strategies that life endows its creatures with. Let's now ask if life seems to be organized and maintained on principles of absolute truth and freedom, and in a way that results in no suffering. It clearly is not. An explanation for how it is not could fill volumes, so I'll just make a few comments that hopefully will make the point. First, our senses evolved to provide information to our brains about our environment and the things in it. It didn't provide us to see and hear everything. In fact, along with limits to what we can perceive, our brains also have inhibitory functions that limit our awareness of even things that we can perceive. Life carries on by attending to what is necessary for life. It seems uninterested in showing us everything and bringing us to some absolute knowledge. It seems that language has evolved in the same manner. Just as it is not necessary for our senses to reveal everything, neither is it necessary for language to tell everything for it to meet the demands of life. Further, beyond our senses, in service to efficiency, our brains are made to organize our sensory perceptions into conceptual categories. If we are kept safe and well fed by other people and have an abundance of free time to think and not spend it finding food and shelter, we can take a closer look and see that our conceptual categories have fuzzy edges In terms of what is really true, these categories are very crude. Yet still, they serve the function of keeping us alive, while philosophers opine on the nature of truth. How concerned is life with our individual freedom? Not very. First, it traps us in a body that has needs. If we don't obey life's demands for maintaining that body, we experience pain and die. It also has situated us in a matrix, a social matrix that necessarily makes demands on us. We have responsibilities. There are things that we must and must not do. If we disregard this, the collective will do what is necessary to bring us back into line or eject us from its circle of care. How free is that? And this is not simply culture being oppressive. Culture is the puppet of nature. And life has evolved, and has life evolved in a way that suggests that it has prioritized the avoidance of suffering? Well, yes and no. Clearly we are endowed with the capacity to feel pain and equipped with cognitive, behavioral, and social mechanisms for avoiding it when possible. At the same time, life has a bigger project than keeping its creatures comfortable. In essence, it perpetuates itself by eating itself. Human beings have managed to no longer be in the food chain, unless you include viruses and parasites, but everything else is. Life also seems to treat each of us like a stepping stone for somewhere else that it's going. In other words, we all die. So does everyone that we love. Along the way, it also is true that we develop by encountering all manner of challenges and stressors, without which we would never mature. Clearly, life doesn't regard suffering as something that needs to be eliminated. It has allowed people to believe it should be eliminated, but will blindly eliminate such people if their beliefs lead to a way of living that doesn't meet its demands. So far, it probably sounds like I have no time for Deconstructionism's aspirations for absolute truth, absolute freedom, and the elimination of suffering. It's not the case. These are noble aspirations that should not be abandoned. They are unattainable ideals that we nevertheless should strive towards. As I said earlier, the problem is what they leave out. I want to propose that each of these aspirational values needs to be dialectically coupled with a corresponding value that can bring it more into alignment with life. I suggest the following dialectical pairings for these aspirational values. The first of each of these pairs is the idealized value, and the second is what life requires. In other words, these dialectics are an attempt to synthesize and integrate Hume's law of is and ought. What ought to be are our ideal values. What is life. To pursue the ought without regard for what is leads us on a path that veers away from life. In other words, a lethal path. So here are the pairings that I propose. We ought to eliminate suffering, coupled with life is unavoidably and necessarily full of suffering. We ought to pursue absolute truth, coupled with life is the arbiter of relative/functional truth. We ought to pursue absolute freedom, coupled with life is hierarchically structured and constraining. We might think of these ideal values as our North Stars. They point in the direction we wish to go. Sailors have been navigating by the stars since they first embarked on sea adventures, but none ever made it to the stars, or even meant to. They are not destinations, but are invaluable toward reaching the other shore, here on Earth, so to speak. No sailor ever felt cheated or disappointed by not finally landing on a star and decided that stars were therefore useless. Nor should we feel cynical and pessimistic when we fail to perfectly establish our ideals, nor should we feel hostile to others who also fail. Remember the core deconstructionist method of examining binary oppositions? We could use its own method to examine its binary opposition of social constructions and deconstruction. Rather than concluding, however, that this binary is simply a false way to understand reality and abandoning it as useless or worse, we could understand instead that each side in the binary offers a partial truth. Rather than reject either or both, we could see them as a dialectic and synthesize them into a greater truth. There's both a time to take things apart and a time to put them back together, with some added improvement. I've not seen where deconstructionism has ever attempted to do this. Instead, It cleverly uses binary oppositions to reveal the insubstantial nature of social constructs, supposedly to liberate us from their oppressive force. It fails to see and use these as dialectical pairs that can be synthesized and integrated for greater understanding and usefulness. In other words, in service to life. The reification of absolute truth and freedom are imagined by critical social justice as the fruit of deconstruction that will emancipate us from oppression. This makes me think of something by way of a metaphor. There's scientific advancements that have allowed us to deconstruct matter down to subatomic particles and even further. We've discovered that what we think of as matter is mostly empty space and energy. Things are seriously not as solid as we think they are. If we misunderstand this discovery and commit to our misunderstanding 100%, we might do stupid things. We might drive a car at 80 miles per hour into a brick wall, thinking that because solidity is an illusion, that makes it possible to not have a fatal collision. This is a very immediate and concrete example of how our ability to deconstruct something doesn't deprive it of reality. Similarly, living as if social constructs are not real and therefore can be disregarded will also result in collisions. And the crash is not just social reprimands and disapproval. Whatever untoward consequences the social construct was meant to avoid will come to pass. The social disapproval is just the group's way of encouraging us not to drive into a brick wall, especially when we aren't the only casualty of such foolishness. We have brakes for a reason. I also want to share a memory from my childhood that had quite an impact on me and got me thinking all kinds of things at an early age. I saw an episode of the TV show The Twilight Zone where a scientist had invented some substance that gave him X-ray vision. In the beginning, it was fun and exciting. You could see through walls and what people were doing. You could see through women's clothing to their naked bodies. How amazing. The problem developed that this substance had a cumulative effect, which meant that he began to see through more and more things. It got to where he could even see through his own hand. Couldn't even see his hand because he saw straight through it. This just kept going until everything he saw, he could see through. He saw through the earth and out into space, then finally he saw through everything in space. Effectively, this rendered him blind, which also drove him mad. Hopefully the connection to deconstructionism is obvious, including the initial phase of fun and excitement and the latter phase of blindness and madness. Very little children like to knock things down, take things apart, pop bubbles, etc. Their impulse is to destroy things. Only later do they learn to build or make things, for instance, stack blocks. Deconstructionists are like children in the playroom of life, going around knocking down stacked blocks and smashing anything that will make an exciting sound or look cool being destroyed. These children play alongside other children, but not with them. If an adult does not intervene soon enough, the other children won't want the child around, constantly destroying things that they make with effort, pride, and enjoyment. This little destroyer will be shunned and avoided. I don't see deconstructionism as any different, except in its ability to persuade other destroyers to gang up and enjoy the fun. Now the kid who says, "Wow, Susie, that's amazing. Would you be interested in taking it apart and seeing what else we could make together?" Or who says, "Hey, Susie, look what I made with the very same stuff." That would demonstrate a dialectic of deconstruction and construction. Postmodernism and deconstructionism don't play well with others except in destructive games. They have the additional charming way of gaslighting their targets by claiming it is all in the name of emancipation, or if not, then at least it's all in good fun. Now let's consider what this all means for psychotherapy. When therapists are indoctrinated by critical social justice in their training with the inevitable emphasis that this places on deconstructionism, this will have a consequence for their practice. The implicitly idealized notions of absolute truth, absolute freedom, and the elimination of suffering will show up in a therapist's way of relating with their clients. They will tend to foster a client's resentment toward any social construction that hampers their individual freedom in any way and regard whatever suffering they experience as an unnecessary consequence of some form of social injustice. They will tend not to include the is with the ought. There will not be a creative dialectical tension between balancing values. This will tend to lean clients out of alignment with life and position them as perpetual victims in a social reality arbitrarily created to oppress them. It's hard to see that this is in any way a good thing. Rather, it's to be stuck in a remote place. I believe that for each of us individually, much confusion and internal conflict can be resolved with a more dialectical way of thinking. A lot more makes sense when we consider our great idealistic aspirations in the context of what life is and what it requires. We need a shift collectively, however, to collectively get out of this stuck place. We need to have dialectical civil discourse, where opposing sets of values are discussed by people who can articulate their own side, but are willing to concede that they might be wrong, and at the very least they are likely to be incomplete in their understanding. This creates the possibility for the thesis and the antithesis to reach a synthesis, the fruit of the dialectic. Here's to hoping we can manage to do this. Thanks for staying with me to the end. That's all for now. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other, and may you drive off-road and not get stuck. Bye for now.